She ran, not walked, not trotted, not slipped quietly into the night like a woman with a plan. She ran, barefoot, 7 months pregnant with triplets, through a forest that didn't care whether she lived or died, with 2 sets of royal boots thundering somewhere behind her and the scent of her own fear rising off her skin like smoke. Henrietta's lungs were on fire. Her feet had stopped hurting around the 3rd mile because they'd gone completely numb, which she was choosing to interpret as a blessing rather than a medical emergency. The roots of the thornwood trees snagged at her dress, the hem already torn to her knees. The moon was either helping her or mocking her, she hadn't decided which, flooding the forest path in silver light that was beautiful enough to be insulting given the circumstances. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself. Then, because whispering felt inadequate, she said it louder. "Keep moving." Her belly, enormous and round and somehow containing 3 entire human beings who had already picked tonight to practice synchronized kicking, lurched as she scrambled over a fallen log. She caught herself on a branch, breathed, counted to 3. "I know," she said to the babies, which was something she'd started doing around month 5 and had decided she wasn't embarrassed about. "I know. It's a lot. It's a lot for me too, babies. We're almost there. Wherever there is." She didn't actually know where there was. That was the honest truth she'd been running from almost as long as she'd been running from the twin alpha kings of Ashenveil, King Kaelin and King Dorian Ashford, who had, in the span of one brutal evening 3 months ago, looked her in the eye and told her she was not enough, not strong enough, not powerful enough, not the right match for a kingdom that needed warriors at its gates and political alliances in its bloodline. Not their true mate, they'd said, which was a lie so spectacular, Henrietta had almost applauded them for the audacity. She had been their mate. Every bone in her body had known it from the first moment she'd stepped into their throne room as a newly presented Omega, fresh, terrified, and trying very hard not to show either. She'd felt the pull. She'd seen their nostrils flare. She'd watched Kaelin's jaw tighten and Dorian's eyes go gold for just a fraction of a second before they both locked it down so hard she almost doubted what she'd seen. Almost. She hadn't doubted. She'd just been naive enough to believe that men who felt the mate bond would honor it. Lesson learned. They had rejected her in front of the full court, in front of every noble and advisor and wide-eyed servant in Ashenveil Castle, while she stood in her best dress with her hair done up in the braids her mother had taught her, and her chin lifted because she refused, absolutely refused, to cry in public. She had walked out of that throne room with her spine straight and her hands shaking in the folds of her skirt, and she had not looked back. She'd found out about the triplets 4 weeks later in a village healer's cottage 3 counties over, and she'd sat very still on the edge of a cot, while the healer repeated the words 3 heartbeats with increasing excitement, and Henrietta had thought, with the absolute calm of a woman whose capacity for shock had been fully exhausted. Well, that's something. She'd kept moving since, town to town, county to county, trading her embroidery work and her cooking and, once memorably, her ability to read contracts to a merchant who couldn't in exchange for food and lodgings. She'd been careful. She'd been clever. She'd used scent-masking herbs every single day because she knew that an alpha with a reason to look would find her if she let them. She'd been careful right up until last week, when the herbs ran out and the village apothecary in Millhaven had looked at her very pregnant belly and said with enormous sympathy that he was so sorry. He'd just sold his last stock, and wasn't it terrible timing? Terrible timing. Sure, let's go with that. She'd felt them coming before she'd heard them. That was the thing about being the rejected mate of twin alpha kings. The bond didn't just disappear because they'd declared it null. It thinned. It frayed, but it didn't break. Not fully. Not for her, and that meant she could feel them in her chest like a compass needle swinging north, and 2 nights ago, that compass had started pointing behind her. Which was how she ended up here, 7 months pregnant, running through Thornwood Forest at midnight, 3 babies doing aerobics in her ribcage, heading directly toward the one piece of land in the entire kingdom she'd been told her whole life never, ever to cross into. The Vane territory. Territory of Lord Emeric Vane, third sovereign of the Northern Reaches, enemy of Ashenveil for 4 generations, and by all accounts a man so ruthless that even the trees on his border grew in straight, disciplined lines out of what appeared to be pure intimidation. Henrietta crossed the border at 12:14 in the morning. She knew the exact moment because the forest changed, subtly but immediately. The air was colder, the undergrowth was thicker but somehow less wild, as if it had been warned to behave. And there were lights. Faint amber lights through the trees, like lanterns or torches, a structure of some kind set back from the tree line. She took exactly 6 more steps before her left ankle turned on a root, and she went down. Not gracefully, not in the slow cinematic way she might have preferred, but fast and ungainly, and with a sound that she was humiliated to admit was something between a yelp and a word her mother would have washed her mouth out for. She caught herself on her hands, sat up, checked her belly with both palms the way she'd started doing every time she stumbled, this rapid automatic inventory, and felt 3 distinct protests from within. "I know," she said breathlessly. "I know, I'm sorry, I've got you." "You've got them?" said a voice above her, "or does someone need to get you?" Henrietta looked up. There were 3 of them, 3 men standing in the tree line with torches, all wearing the dark gray of Vane household guards, all staring at her with varying degrees of alarm and confusion. The one who'd spoken was tallest, with a scar across his chin and the expression of a man who had prepared for many things tonight, and a pregnant woman running out of the dark was not among them. "I'm fine," Henrietta said, with great dignity, from the ground. "You fell," the guard said. "I was about to get up. Your hands are bleeding." She looked at her hands. He was correct. Minor detail. He gestured at her belly in a way that was clearly meant to be tactful and landed somewhere short of it. "Pregnant," she confirmed. "Very. Don't worry about it, I'll just—" She pushed herself up, and her ankle screamed in protest, and she pressed her lips together and stood anyway because she had not survived 3 months of running, and a full court rejection, and the discovery of Triplets to collapse in front of a guard with a torch. "I'm fine," she said again. "I'll move on." "Move on where?" said one of the other guards, smaller, younger, with the kind of face that still held traces of being a child. "This is Vane territory. You can't just move on through." "I understand that. Lord Vane will want to know about this." "He absolutely does not need to—" But the tallest guard had already turned his head to one side, the way men did when they were communicating with their alpha through the pack bond, eyes going briefly distant, and Henrietta's stomach dropped. "He's coming," the guard said, turning back to her. Something in his face had shifted. Not unkind, but serious. "You need to stay here." Henrietta looked behind her into the dark of the forest. She looked ahead toward the amber lights. She looked down at her hands, cut and shaking. She looked at her feet, which had finally started hurting again, which meant feeling had returned, which was the medical blessing she'd been waiting for and also the worst possible timing. She did the only logical thing. She sat back down on the forest floor, pressed her back against the nearest tree, and said, "Fine. But I want it noted that I'm here under protest and not because I've given up. I haven't given up. I'm just resting." The youngest guard blinked at her. "Noted," he said, uncertainly. "Good." She smoothed her torn skirt over her knees with as much poise as a woman could muster while sitting on dirt in a hostile forest at midnight. "Now, does anyone have water? Because I've been running for 3 hours and your employer's trees are not as hospitable as they look." The guard with the scar, whose name turned out to be Aldrich, delivered in a gruff, unreluctant tone as if names were currency he was spending against his will, gave her water, not cheerfully, not warmly, but he gave it to her, and Henrietta drank it in long, grateful pulls while the forest watched and the babies kicked, and somewhere behind her, in the dark, she felt that compass needle swinging, still coming. She had maybe an hour, maybe less. She handed the flask back to Aldrich. "Thank you. Don't mention it. I mean it." That was genuinely kind. You should feel good about yourself. He stared at her. You're very strange. I'm very tired, she corrected. They're similar presentations. The youngest guard, she'd mentally named him Pip because he had that energy, was still staring at her belly with the expression of someone who had recently learned where babies came from and was still processing. How many are in there? He asked, then immediately looked like he regretted it. 3, Henrietta said. Pip's eyes went wide. 3. Yes. At the same time? That is typically how triplets work. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. And their father is not a topic we'll be covering tonight, Henrietta said pleasantly, or possibly ever, moving on. The third guard hadn't spoken at all. He was stationed slightly apart from the others, facing back toward the estate lights, and his posture had changed in the last 30 seconds in a way that Henrietta recognized, the particular stillness of someone whose alpha was approaching. She'd seen it in enough packmen to know the sequence. Stillness, then the slight lift of the chin, then the barely perceptible straightening of the spine, and like something in the body snapping to attention against the owner's will. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. She should have heard footsteps on this terrain, but she didn't. What she heard was something quieter and somehow louder than that, a quality of presence that preceded him like a change in air pressure. The torchlight shifted, reached, and then Lord Emmerich Vane stepped out of the dark and into her immediate crisis, and Henrietta's first coherent thought was, well, nobody warned me about that. He was tall, not Kaelin tall, not the engineered, deliberate height of a king who had always known he'd be looked up at, but tall the way trees were tall, like he hadn't particularly planned for it, and the world had simply arranged itself around the outcome. Dark hair. A jaw that appeared to have been carved by someone with opinions about geometry, and eyes. Pale gray, almost colorless in the torchlight, the kind of eyes that catalogued things rather than simply looked at them. He looked at her. He catalogued her, the torn dress, the bleeding hands, the bare feet, the considerable and undeniable belly. He took his time doing it. She noticed he didn't do the thing most alpha men did when confronted with a pregnant woman, which was look away in something between embarrassment and discomfort, treating her like a condition rather than a person. He just looked, steady, assessing, not unkind. You crossed my border, he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that had never needed to rise to be heard. I did, Henrietta said, under extenuating circumstances. Which are? I'm being hunted. She paused. By the kings of Ashenveil. Something moved across his face, not surprise, something more controlled than that. A recalibration. Kaelin and Dorian Ashford are hunting you. They are. Why? Henrietta looked at him steadily. Because they made a mistake 3 months ago and powerful men don't like living with their mistakes. They'd rather catch them and lock them back up somewhere tidy. Emmerich Vane was quiet for a moment. She watched him process this, watched him work through the geometry of the situation, a pregnant omega on his land, 2 enemy kings approaching through the forest, a border dispute that had been simmering for decades suddenly presenting itself in the form of 1 very tired woman and 3 unborn heirs. Can you walk? He asked. With some creative interpretation of the word yes. His mouth moved. Oh, not quite a smile. Something that remembered what smiles were. Aldrich, my lord, help her. Aldrich looked at Henrietta with the expression of a man who had signed up for perimeter duty and was deeply suspicious of how the night had evolved. But he held out a hand, and Henrietta took it, and she stood, and when her ankle protested, she didn't make a sound. This way, Emmerich said. She followed him, because what were her options? Sleep in the forest? Let Kaelin and Dorian drag her back to Ashenveil and present her triplets as property of the crown? She had exactly 1 card left to play, and it was the calculated risk of a man who hated her pursuers more than he had reason to harm her. She'd take those odds. The path through the Vane estate grounds was well maintained and lit at intervals, and despite the pain in her ankle and the weight of her belly and the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears, Henrietta noticed things. She always noticed things. It was one of her more inconvenient qualities, this relentless habit of observation even in crisis. She noticed the torches were real flame, not the new crystal light that the wealthy in Ashenveil had started using. She noticed the guards at the estate gate moved without being signaled, stepping aside as Emmerich approached with the ease of men who trusted their lord's judgment. She noticed the grounds were immaculate but not sterile. There were roses along the eastern wall, overgrown in the particular way of something once tended and then let go. She noticed, as they crossed into the estate courtyard, and that Emmerich had slowed his pace to match hers without drawing attention to the fact. He hadn't offered his arm. He hadn't hovered. He'd simply adjusted, and that small, quiet thing made something tighten in her chest that she immediately told herself to stop. Absolutely not. We are not doing that tonight. Inside was warm. A housekeeper appeared, brisk, silver-haired, with the competent energy of a woman who kept the world running while everyone around her was being dramatic. She took one look at Henrietta and did not waste a single second. "Bath," the woman said. "Clean clothes, food. In that order. Come, child." "I'm not a child," Henrietta said. "I'm 23. "You're barefoot and bleeding, and you've got 3 passengers. You're a child." She gestured firmly. "Come." Henrietta looked back at Emmerich, who was watching the exchange with that same, almost expression. "Your housekeeper," she said, "is terrifying." "I know," he said. "It's her best quality." "What's your name?" the housekeeper asked, already steering her toward a corridor. "Henrietta." "Good solid name. I'm Marit. Don't argue with me. I've been managing this household for 20 years, and I have buried 3 lords, 2 of them stubborn men who thought they knew better than me." She paused. "Metaphorically. Mostly." Henrietta decided she loved Marit with her whole heart. The bath was hot, and the clothes Marit produced were soft and enormous enough to accommodate what Henrietta had started privately thinking of as the situation. She ate. Really ate, more than she had in weeks. Because pride was a luxury, and her children needed calories, and she sat by a fire in a small, warm room and let the heat work into her bones while the babies settled into the particular quilted stillness that meant they'd decided the current environment was acceptable. She had maybe 40 minutes before Kaylin and Dorian hit the border. She needed a plan. There was a knock at the door. She said, "Come in," and Emmerich entered, and he had the look of a man who had been thinking hard since he'd left her in Maret's care. He sat in the chair across from her without being invited, which she noted, and folded his hands and looked at her. "Tell me about the heirs," he said. Direct. She appreciated direct. "What do you want to know?" "They're Kaylin and Dorian Ashford's children." "Yes." "And they rejected you?" "Publicly, theatrically, in front of approximately 200 witnesses. And they're only hunting you now." "Because," Henrietta said, "they have a problem. The Ashenveil succession line requires a born heir within the king's first year of reign. That window closes in 19 days. They have no other prospects. And someone, somehow, found out I'm pregnant." Emmerich's pale eyes sharpened. "So they don't want you back?" "No. They want the babies." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Henrietta held his gaze. "Yes," she said quietly. "They want the heirs. I am, at best, incidental to their plans." Emmerich was silent for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a wolf howl lifted into the night, one of the Ashenveil trackers, close, very close, and both of them heard it, and neither looked away from each other. "What do you want?" Emmerich asked. Nobody had asked her that in 3 months. The question hit her somewhere unexpected, and she had to hold very still to keep her face composed. "I want my children to be safe," she said, "and I want them to know they are wanted, by someone." Emmerich looked at her for another long moment. Then he stood. "Then I suggest," he said, "that you let me answer the door when your kings arrive." She didn't sleep. She sat in that warm room by the fire while Maret checked on her twice, and the babies performed what felt like a small, organized protest in her midsection, and she listened to the estate around her. The movement of guards, the distant sound of voices at the gate, the low particular vibration of something happening that she couldn't see. The compass in her chest was screaming. They were here. She heard Kaylin's voice first. She would have known it anywhere, that precise, measured tone that never quite rose to anger but got very, very cold instead. She couldn't make out the words through two walls and a corridor, but she could hear the cadence of it, controlled, demanding, performing patience for an audience while being furious underneath. Then Dorian, whose anger worked the opposite way, warmer on the surface and burning hotter below it, the kind of voice that smiled while it destroyed things. Then Emmerich, steady, even, immovable. She pressed her palm flat against her belly and breathed. The door opened. Maret slipped in, closed it behind her, and leaned against it with the expression of someone who had witnessed something worth reporting. "Your kings are at the gate." "They're not my kings." "No," Maret agreed. "Nah, they don't appear to be. Lord Vane has declined to let them onto the grounds." Henrietta blinked. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that they have entered Vane territory without permission, in pursuit of a woman who has claimed sanctuary, and that the laws of the northern reaches on the matter of sanctuary are, and I'm quoting our Lord directly now, unambiguous and not subject to the interpretation of Ashenveil monarchs." Maret folded her hands. "He also said some other things that I won't repeat because you seem like a person with sensibilities." "What did the king say?" "The blonde one, Dorian, said some things that were very creative and not at all legal. The dark one is being quiet, which I'm told is worse." She tilted her head. "You look like you expected this to go differently." "I expected Emmerich Vane to hand me over in exchange for a political favor." Maret looked at her in the manner of a woman who knew something and was deciding whether to tell it. "Lord Vane doesn't trade in people, he never has." She paused. "It's one of the ways he's different from your kings." "They're not—" I know." From somewhere outside came the sound of raised voices, plural now, the distinctive layered pressure of two alpha kings being denied something simultaneously, which Henrietta imagined was a sound rarely heard in the world simply because it rarely happened. She stood. Maret made a motion to stop her. Henrietta gave her a look. Maret stepped aside. She found her way back through the corridor by memory and instinct, and the compass in her chest that pointed, infuriatingly, simultaneously toward all three of the men currently gathered at the gate. She pushed open a heavy side door and stepped out into the cool night air, onto a stone terrace that overlooked the estate's front approach. She could see them clearly from here. Kaylin stood slightly forward of his brother. He always had, even in the throne room, that unconscious positioning of himself as the point of any blade. His dark hair was disheveled from running, which she had never seen before, and his jaw was set in the hard, particular way that meant he was controlling something. He was looking at Emmerich. He hadn't looked up to the terrace yet. Dorian was scanning the grounds. He was going to find her in approximately 4 seconds. 3, 2. His eyes locked on her, and everything on his face did something complicated and immediate that she refused to analyze. "Henrietta." He said her name like it had been sitting in his throat for months. Kaylin's head snapped up. And there it was, the thing she'd spent 3 months trying to outrun. The way his face changed. Not in a performative way, not for anyone watching. Just changed. Like a lock opening, like a man who'd been holding his breath finally exhaling. She hated that she noticed. "Come down," Kaylin said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that she had never heard from him before. "Henrietta, please. Please," she repeated, loudly enough to carry. "That's new." Dorian's jaw tightened. "We need to talk. We needed to talk 3 months ago. I believe what happened instead was you told me, in front of your entire court, that I was inadequate. That's not—" He stopped, looked at her belly. Something moved across his face that she had no category for. "We didn't know," Kaylin said. We didn't know you were pregnant? She said the word cleanly, without softening it. No, you didn't, because you rejected me before we found out. So I want you to be very clear with yourselves about which came first, the rejection or the knowledge of the pregnancy. Because I will not be wanted because of what I'm carrying. My children will not be bargaining chips. The silence that followed was enormous. Emmerich stood between them and the gate, with his arms loose at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man prepared to be either diplomat or wall, depending on which the situation required. He said nothing. He didn't look at her. But she had the distinct impression he was listening to every word. "We made a mistake," Dorian said finally. Not loudly, not grandly. Just said it, plain, into the night air, with Kaelin beside him going very still the way he did when he was feeling something he didn't have language for. "We made a mistake and we know it, and we have known it since the night you walked out, and Henrietta, we have been looking for you for 3 months." "I know," she said. "I could feel you looking." That landed. She watched it land on both of them. "The bond," Kaelin said quietly. "The bond you declared null doesn't feel particularly null from where I'm standing. Has it ever? From where you're standing?" Neither of them answered, which was its own answer, and something in her chest cracked a little at the edges in a way she couldn't afford right now. "You came here because you need heirs," she said. "I understand that. I understand the political reality of your succession window. I'm not stupid, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know why 2 kings crossed 3 counties in the middle of the night, chasing a woman's scent through Thornwood Forest." She pressed her hand to her belly. "But these are not just heirs. These are my children, and I am not coming back to a kingdom that didn't want me, so you can take what you need and lock me somewhere comfortable and call it gratitude." "That's not what we want," Kaelin said. "Then tell me what you want," she said. "Tell me exactly what you want, not what you need, not what the kingdom requires, what you want." Another silence, longer. And in that silence, Dorian did something she genuinely did not expect. He walked forward, past Emmerich, past the gate that Emmerich had not actually locked, because he'd known, apparently, that locking it would have made things worse, and he stopped at the base of the terrace steps and looked up at her. "I want you," he said. "I have wanted you since the moment you walked into our throne room and looked at us like we were mildly inconvenient and not remotely frightening, and I told myself it was the bond, and it wasn't the bond, Henrietta. It was you. Just you." He paused. "I'm sorry it took me this long to say it outside my own head." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Kaelin, who was still at the gate with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't walk back from, and he said nothing. But he held her gaze with everything he had, and that somehow said more. She became aware that Emmerich had turned and was looking at her too, from his position between the kings and the gate, not possessively, not with expectation, but with something quieter, like a man who had walked into a story already in progress and was carefully determining what role, if any, belonged to him. "It's cold," she said finally, "and I've had a long night, and my children are very tired of me making important decisions under emotional duress." She straightened. "Everyone come inside. We're going to have a conversation like adults, with chairs." Marit produced chairs, tea, and the kind of expression that said she was filing every detail of this situation for later. She arranged the sitting room with the particular geometry of a woman who understood that physical space was diplomatic, placed Henrietta in the chair closest to the fire with a footstool she hadn't asked for but desperately needed, and then positioned herself in the doorway in a way that communicated clearly she was not leaving. Henrietta did not tell her to leave. Kaelin and Dorian sat across from her. Emmerich stood by the window, which was either principled neutrality or territorial awareness. She suspected both. The fire popped. Nobody spoke for a moment that stretched until it had texture. "Start," Henrietta said, "from the beginning, the real beginning, not the version where you were making wise political decisions. I want the actual reason you rejected me." Kaelin's hands tightened around his tea. He'd accepted the tea without appearing to notice he'd done it, which told her he was more unsettled than he looked. "There's a faction," he said slowly, "within the Ashenveil court. Old families. Old money. They have been opposed to the mate bond system since before our father's time. They believe kings should choose alliances, not mates. They pressured you. They did more than pressure." He looked up. His eyes were very dark. "They presented evidence, fabricated evidence, we know that now, that you were not our true mate, that the pull we felt was manufactured, a compulsion spell." She stared at him. "A compulsion spell." "Yes. You believed that." A pause. "We doubted it. He stopped, pressed his lips together. "We were afraid," he said, and she could tell how much that sentence cost him. "We felt something neither of us had ever felt before, and the moment we did, someone was in our ear telling us it wasn't real, and he exhaled. "We chose doubt, because doubt was safer than what the alternative meant." "What did it mean?" she asked. Dorian answered, "It meant giving you everything, and kings who have been taught since birth that everything they have can be used against them." He stopped. "We aren't good at that. Giving everything." "Yes." Henrietta looked at her tea. She turned the cup in her hands. One of the babies was pressing against her ribs from the inside, a steady, determined pressure that she'd started interpreting as commentary. "So you panicked," she said, "and you chose public humiliation over private conversation." "Yes," Kaelin said, "and it didn't occur to you to, I don't know, speak to me? Before the court, before the audience, to say there is doubt here, there is fear here, can we discuss this?" "No," Dorian said. "It didn't. We were catastrophically stupid." He said it without deflection, which she had not expected from a king. "I want that on record, historically stupid, the kind of stupid that gets written down." From the doorway, Marit made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You're not wrong," Henrietta said. "It's going to be in every history book. The year the twin kings of Ashenveil rejected their fated mate out of fear and spent 3 months in consequences." She looked up. "What about the faction, the court advisors who fed you the fabricated evidence?" Kaelin's expression did something cold. "Handled." "Handled how?" "Completely," he said. And the word had a finality to it that told her she'd gotten as much detail as she was going to get, and that it was enough. "And the faction's influence on the succession question? Is it genuine? The 19-day window?" "Yes." Dorian leaned forward. "The bloodline requirement is real, it's ancient, and the kingdom has been in succession crisis since the start of our reign because we didn't have a mate. The court is fracturing. There are 3 noble houses positioning to challenge the throne if we don't produce heirs, which is exactly why—" "I want to be very clear," Henrietta said, cutting through cleanly, "that if you are here for the babies and not for me, I need you to say so now. Because I have spent 3 months being no one's priority, and I have arranged my entire life around my children's safety. And I will walk back into that forest tonight before I become a broodmare for a crown that rejected me." The silence was absolute. Kaelin set down his tea. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and he looked at her in a way that had nothing performative about it. No king, no court, no 200 witnesses. Just a man who had spent 3 months in the wreckage of his own mistake. "I don't want heirs," he said quietly. "I want you back. The heirs are—" he faltered. "They're extraordinary, and they're ours, and I want them the way I want sunlight and water, which is to say, not as a political asset, but as something that should exist in my life. But that's not why I'm here." His voice dropped further. "I'm here because I haven't slept in 3 months. I'm here because everything in the bond has been pointing north, and I've been ignoring it like an idiot. I'm here because I am sorry, Henrietta. In whatever language, whatever measure, I am sorry, and I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm asking you to let me begin to deserve it." She let the words settle into the room. She became aware that Emmerich had shifted by the window. She glanced at him. He was looking at Kaylin with the expression of a man reassessing a position he'd held for a long time. She filed that away. "There's a third thing I haven't told you," she said. Both kings stilled. "The midwife in Millhaven told me something in the last examination, something about the babies." She looked down at her belly. "They're not just triplets, they're—" She searched for the word. She called them convergent, pack-born. She said it happens rarely with fated mates, that the children carry both bloodlines so completely that they're born into a natural alpha convergence, that they would be the first of a new kind of pack lineage. She seemed very excited about it. The room was very quiet. "She also said," Henrietta continued, "that this only happens when the bond is genuine, when the mate pull is real and mutual and—" She looked at Kaylin and Dorian both. "Unmanufactured." Dorian laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man arriving very late to information that would have been useful 3 months ago. "Of course," he said. "Of course." "I want to know," Emmerich said from the window, and everyone looked at him. "What happens to this conversation tonight? Not to the kingdom, not to the succession, tonight. Where does she sleep? Where does she eat? What happens to her in the next 12 hours? It was directed at the kings, and there was nothing hostile in it, but there was something beneath it, a question within the question, and Henrietta heard both layers. "She stays here," Kaylin said after a pause. "If that's her choice. In safety, under Lord Vane's hospitality if he extends it, until she decides what she wants." Emmerich looked at Henrietta. "Lord Vane," she said carefully, "I've been on your property for approximately 2 hours, disrupted your night, brought 2 kings to your gate, and eaten what I suspect was a very good ham. I should ask, what do you want from this situation?" He considered her for a long moment. "Nothing," he said. "You came here for sanctuary. Sanctuary doesn't come with a price." "Everything comes with a price," Dorian said. Not unkindly. Emmerich looked at him with something that was almost rueful. "In Ashenveil," he said, "perhaps. Not here." Henrietta looked between all 3 of them, the 2 kings who had broken her heart and had come 3 counties to say they were sorry, and the man who had opened his gate at midnight for a barefoot stranger because she'd needed it. And something inside her, some calculus she hadn't known she was running, produced an unexpected result. She was not running anymore. She was tired of running. She was 7 months pregnant and her ankle hurt and her children needed stability, and she was, if she was being honest, still in love with 2 men who had been catastrophically stupid and somehow also completely sincere in their wretchedness about it. "I want," she said to the room, "to go to sleep. I want to do that without anyone hovering in the corridor. And in the morning, I want to have a real conversation about what my life looks like, with all parties." She looked at Emmerich. "Including you if you're willing." Emmerich tilted his head. "Willing for what?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But you opened the gate. That means something. I'd like to know what it means to you." She slept 8 hours without dreaming, which was the first time that had happened since the rejection, and she woke to the smell of real food, not traveler's bread or market stall pies, but actual food, prepared by someone who cared about the outcome, and to the sound of 3 male voices in the corridor having what appeared to be an extremely strained conversation. She lay still for a moment and listened. "Not your negotiation to run," Dorian was saying. "No one is negotiating," Emmerich's voice, flat and entirely unbothered. "I asked if she needed anything before breakfast. That is not a negotiation. You've known her for 6 hours. I know. You've known her for considerably longer and rejected her publicly. I'm not sure time is the variable that matters here." A pause. A very pointed pause. "He has a point," Kaylin said, somewhere further down the corridor, and Dorian apparently did not appreciate that. Henrietta pressed her face into the pillow and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of something that was close to laughter before composing herself, sitting up, and addressing her midsection. "Good morning," she said. Yes, I know. It's a situation. We're handling it. 3 kicks, sequential, like a little agreement chorus. Exactly, she said. Marit arrived before she could stand, not knocking, exactly, more announcing herself by presence, and set a tray on the bedside table with the efficiency of someone who had already assessed the morning's requirements and met them. Hot tea, bread with actual butter, fruit, and what appeared to be a small pot of honey. Henrietta's eyes went briefly emotional about the honey, and she chose not to examine why. The lords are in the dining room, Marit said. All 3 of them. Surprisingly, they haven't drawn weapons. That's progress. Lord Vane sent for his senior council at dawn. The Ashenveil kings sent a message to their court at the same hour. She paused. This is becoming a formal situation. It already was a formal situation, I just haven't put on formal clothes yet. Marit produced, from somewhere Henrietta didn't track, a dress. It was deep green, soft, and cut with enough room to accommodate her that it could not have been in Maret's regular inventory, which meant it had been procured this morning, deliberately. Henrietta looked at it and then looked at Marit. Lord Vane, Marit said simply. He thought you might need something that wasn't torn. Henrietta touched the fabric. It was good quality, not the extreme luxury of the Ashenveil court, not designed to impress. Just good, practical, kind. He's a confusing man, she said. No, Marit said. He's a straightforward man who lives in a world that keeps finding him confusing. She helped Henrietta into the dress with the matter-of-fact care of someone who understood that accepting help was not weakness when your center of gravity had moved 3 feet forward. He lost his wife 4 years ago, she added, in the tone of someone sharing information and not a story. She was his true mate. He's been, she paused, present, but not quite here. Henrietta absorbed this quietly. Until last night, Marit added, and then picked up the breakfast tray and walked out before Henrietta could respond. She entered the dining room to silence. All 3 men stood, which was either courtesy or instinct, but either way she noted it. And she looked at the table, which had been set for 4, and she sat down, and after a moment they sat down too, and Marit appeared from nowhere with more food, and for a few minutes the morning reorganized itself around the ordinary business of eating. We need to talk about what happens next, Kaelin said finally. Yes, Henrietta agreed. We do, and before we do, I need ground rules. Both kings looked at her. Emmerich continued drinking his tea. Ground rules, Dorian repeated. I'm serious. I'm a woman who has spent 3 months running for her life with triplets. I have earned ground rules. First, she held up a finger. I am not going anywhere until the babies are born safely. I am 7 months pregnant, and I have 3 months left, and I am not traveling across the kingdom for any political reason, no matter what the succession window looks like. Kaelin opened his mouth. The succession. 19 days, she said. I know. The window closes in 19 days. Here is what I know about succession law, Kaelin. Which I know because I spent a month in a village with an excellent library and absolutely nothing else to do. The window requires that the king's acknowledged mate be carrying a confirmed heir. It does not require the heir to be born. It requires acknowledgement. She looked at him. You acknowledge me as your mate, on record with witnesses. The window is met. The babies aren't due for 10 weeks. That's a political solution that requires approximately 15 minutes of your time and none of mine involving travel. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before. This one was the silence of 2 kings recalibrating. She's right, Dorian said after a moment, in the tone of a man genuinely surprised by joy. That's exactly right. I know, Henrietta said. How do you know succession law? I told you. Our village library, also spite, is an excellent motivator for research. Emmerich made a sound that was definitively a laugh, quickly controlled, and both kings looked at him with expressions that indicated this was unusual enough to register. Second ground rule, Henrietta continued. I will not return to Ashenveil until I have decided, not been convinced, decided, that it is the right choice for me and for my children. You are welcome to make your case. You are not welcome to pressure or leverage the succession window or imply that I owe you anything because you've apologized, because I don't. An apology is a beginning, not a currency. Kaelin nodded once. Agreed. Dorian? Agreed. Pause. For the record, I hate this, the agreeing. It feels like losing something. It isn't, she said. It's the opposite. She looked at him levelly. You rejected me because giving me everything felt dangerous. Learning to agree with me is how you practice the other thing. He looked at her. Something in his face went soft, and immediately tried to pretend it hadn't. Third ground rule. She looked at Emmerich. You're part of this conversation. Not because I've decided anything, I haven't, but because you opened your gate at midnight and sent someone to buy me a dress and you haven't once in the last 12 hours treated me like a problem to be solved, and I think that deserves acknowledgement. I don't need acknowledgement, Emmerich said. I know. That's exactly why you're getting it. Marit, from the doorway, was doing nothing to conceal that she was watching this unfold with great satisfaction. The faction that fabricated evidence against you, Emmerich said to Henrietta, now in the careful tone of a man entering a subject sideways. You should know. They've been operating across the border too, feeding information to certain parties in the northern reaches about Ashenveil's succession weakness, destabilizing both kingdoms simultaneously. Kaelin went very still. You have evidence. I have documentation. 3 years of it. He met Kaelin's eyes. I've been building a case, alone, because I had no one to build it with. The implication hung in the air with extraordinary clarity. 4 generations of enmity between 2 houses, and a woman who had walked across the border into the middle of it at midnight and accidentally created the conditions for the only conversation that might have ended it. The faction, Dorian said slowly. They benefited from keeping you and Ashenveil opposed. Yes. They manufactured the evidence against Henrietta partly to prevent the mate bond from stabilizing the Ashenveil succession, which would have closed the window of instability they were exploiting. Yes. Henrietta looked between them all. So I am, she said, slowly, at the center of a political conspiracy that spans 2 kingdoms and 4 years. Yes, all 3 said simultaneously. I need more honey, she said. This is a more honey situation. Marit was already at her elbow. The formal acknowledgement happened in Emmerich Vane's great hall, which had been hastily but genuinely prepared. The house guards assembled, Marit present as witness. A notary Emmerich apparently kept on staff because he was that kind of organized man. Kaelin and Dorian stood before Henrietta, and they spoke the words that kings spoke to mates in formal acknowledgement, and they said her name clearly, and she held her chin up the way she had in the throne room 3 months ago, and did not cry, mostly, except for approximately 20 seconds toward the end, when Dorian's voice did something that she refused to describe. The notary recorded it. The succession window was met with 16 days to spare. After, in the corridor, Kaelin found her alone and stood at a careful distance, the careful distance of a man who had learned something about space and was choosing to honor it. I know you haven't decided, he said. I know that what we did cost something that doesn't restore in a day, but I want to say something, not as a king, not for the record. He looked at her. I have been afraid my entire life of the thing I want most. I don't know how to do it differently yet. But I want to learn, with you, if you'll allow it. She looked at him for a long time, at the man underneath the king, not small, never small, but human, afraid, stubborn about hope in the way that people were when hope had cost them before. I know, she said quietly. I know you're afraid. I was afraid in your throne room. I didn't let it make the decision for me. She paused. Think about that. He did. She could see him doing it. She left him in the corridor and went to find Emmerich, who was in the estate library. Of course he was, she thought. Now, of course he was the kind of man who went to the library, standing at the window with a folder of documents open on the desk, and his expression doing that not quite present thing she'd noticed before. She closed the door behind her. "You're thinking about her," she said. He turned. He didn't ask who she meant. "Sometimes," he said, "when things are quiet. I'm sorry." "Don't be." She would have. He stopped. Something moved across his face that was private, and she didn't push into it. "She would have found this entire situation hilarious," he said finally. And there was grief in it, but something else too, something loosening. "The bond," Henrietta said carefully, "between you and her. It was real." "Yes." "And it didn't end when she did." "No." He looked at her. "It doesn't work like that." "I know." She thought about the compass in her chest, the needle that had pointed toward two men who'd hurt her and pulled her north through the dark anyway. "It doesn't ask your permission. The bond." "No," he said. "It doesn't." "I don't know what I'm going to decide," she told him honestly. "I have 3 babies coming and 2 kings apologizing and an entire kingdom's succession crisis that apparently hinged on my ankles clearing the border last night. I don't have room right now for—" She gestured vaguely. "I'm not asking for room," he said. "I asked for nothing. I meant it." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "But you told me that the acknowledgement documentation was for the record, that it covered the succession, and then you stayed in the room the whole time, Emmerich." He was quiet. "You could have left," she said. "You stayed." He turned back to the window. Below, in the courtyard, Dorian was pacing. She could see the top of his bright head through the glass, and Kalen was sitting very still on a bench with his face tipped up toward the morning sky, doing that thing she recognized as him processing something too big for thinking. "My wife used to say," Emmerich said slowly, "that I was the worst liar she'd ever met, that I said nothing rather than lie, and it was transparent as glass because I said nothing so rarely." He paused. "I'm saying nothing now." Henrietta looked at him. "I know," she said gently. "I'll remember that." She left him to his library. She found Dorian in the courtyard, who was pacing because Dorian processed things physically. She remembered that from the throne room. And the barely contained energy of him, the sense that he thought with his body as much as his mind. She sat on the bench Kalen had vacated, which was sun-warmed and exactly what her back needed, and she watched him pace for a moment. "You're going to wear a groove in Lord Vane's courtyard," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "Many things." "Pick one." She tilted her head. "I'm thinking that I spent 3 months being angry, and I'm still angry, and I'm also—" She searched. "I'm also not just angry, and that's complicated, and I haven't finished sorting it." "Okay." He sat beside her. Close, but not touching, honoring the distance she hadn't asked for, but he'd apparently understood she needed. "I can wait for the rest." "Dorian, you said last night that you have wanted me since the throne room. That it wasn't just the bond." "Yes." "Then why?" she said, and her voice came out slightly less steady than she intended. "Did it take a 3-month chase across the kingdom for you to say it?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because I was a king who had been taught that what I wanted was not a relevant factor. I was taught to consider the kingdom, the alliance, the bloodline, everything except the inside of my own chest." He looked at her. "You asked me to consider what I want, in front of Emmerich and Kalen and the fire and the whole miserable night, and I realized I'd been asked that question exactly 0 times before, that it was—" He stopped, exhaled. "Novel, and overdue." She looked at her hands in her lap. Her palms had healed overnight, quickly, the way omega wounds did when stress levels dropped and the body had resources to spare. "I'm not ready to say I forgive you," she said. "I want that to be honest between us." "I know. But I'm also not—" She stopped, started again. The bond is not gone. I want you to know that. Whatever you made me feel in that throne room, it's not gone, and I'm not going to pretend it is just to protect myself." He looked at her with an expression that had nothing guarded about it at all. "Henrietta, don't say anything sentimental right now," she said immediately. "I just told you something real. Let it be real." He closed his mouth. And then he did something she genuinely did not see coming. He reached out carefully and set his hand beside hers on the bench, not taking it, not closing the distance, just present, adjacent, available. She let the silence hold. 3 weeks later, Henrietta went back to Ashenveil. Not because they asked, and not because of the succession, and not because the babies needed a kingdom, though they did, and it was a good kingdom when it was running correctly, and with the faction cleared out, it ran considerably better. She went back because she had made a decision that was hers, based on evidence she'd collected herself. Kaelin had spent 19 days not once referring to the babies as heirs in her presence, only as the babies, and once memorably as those 3 tiny menaces which she had found inexplicably endearing. Dorian had taken to sitting beside her in the mornings, in a silence that asked nothing of her, steady and warm and present, and she'd realized somewhere around day 10 that she'd stopped bracing for it. Noah and Emmerich Vane had come to Ashenveil, not as an enemy, as something that 4 generations had never managed to produce between the 2 houses, an ally. He'd brought his documentation on the faction. He'd sat across a formal table from Kaelin and Dorian and discussed terms with the careful, precise language of a man who had built a case alone for 3 years and was finally, cautiously, trying the unfamiliar architecture of not being alone. He'd looked at Henrietta across that table once, during a break in the proceedings, and she'd held his gaze for a long moment. She'd decided she wanted to know what it meant to him. She was still deciding. She was allowed to be still deciding. The triplets were born on a Tuesday, 6 weeks later, and in a room with sunlight and 3 grown men hovering at varying distances, and Marit, who had traveled with the household and been installed in the Ashenveil castle with the unstoppable force of a woman who had identified a situation requiring management, at Henrietta's side throughout. 3 boys, pack-born, convergent, exactly what the midwife had predicted, carrying the weight of 2 royal bloodlines and a diplomatic treaty, and the quiet miracle of a bond that had refused to break even when everyone involved had made a mess of it. Kaelin held the first one and looked like a man who had expected to feel duty and felt something else entirely, something without language for it, and had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Dorian held the second and immediately started telling him things in a low voice that were clearly important, and possibly about court strategy, which Henrietta told him was completely inappropriate for a newborn. "They should start early," Dorian said without looking up. "They're 20 minutes old." "Exactly. We're already behind." She laughed. Actually laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in longer than she could measure. And it filled the room, and Kaelin looked at her like she'd done something extraordinary just by making sound. Emmerich held the third. He held him for a long time, with a care so complete it was almost painful to witness. He didn't say anything. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright, and he looked at Henrietta, and he said very quietly, "He has your expression." "Which one? The one that says you see everything and you're filing it away for later?" She looked at him. She looked at the baby in his arms, her baby, convergent and pack-born and somehow, impossibly, both entirely hers and part of something larger than she'd planned. She looked at Kaelin, still looking at the ceiling, and at Dorian, still apparently briefing a newborn on succession law. "Emmerich," she said. "Yes. You're going to have to stop visiting Ashenveil eventually and just stay." The room was very quiet. "Is that an invitation?" he asked. "It's a ground rule," she said. "I have a lot of them." His mouth moved into the thing that had been becoming a smile for 6 weeks and finally committed to it, fully, for the first time. It rearranged his face entirely and made Marit, Nut from the doorway, press her hand to her chest and look at the ceiling. Kaylin looked at Dorian. Dorian looked at Kaylin. Something passed between them, the twin shorthand that she'd learned to read over 6 weeks of careful observation, and Dorian said, to the room at large, "Well, we're not going to be the ones to object." "Nobody asked you," Henrietta said fondly. "Nobody ever does," Dorian agreed. "I talk anyway. It's one of my qualities." "It's one of your several qualities," she allowed. "Several," he repeated, and seemed genuinely pleased with that accounting. Kaylin came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and he didn't say anything because he was still Kaylin, and words were where he was slow. But he set his hand over hers, and the bond in her chest settled for the first time in months into something that felt less like a compass pointing somewhere she hadn't arrived yet, and more like home. Just home. She had 3 babies and a resolved conspiracy and a treaty between kingdoms that hadn't spoken in 4 generations, and 2 kings who were learning, slowly, imperfectly, with full awareness of their deficit, how to want something and not be afraid of the wanting. She had Marit, who was already reorganizing the Ashenveil household with terrifying competence, and had opinions about the nursery. She had Emmerich, who was a man who said nothing rather than lie, and who had stayed in the room when he could have left. She had ground rules, and she had herself, Henrietta, you who had run barefoot through Thornwood Forest at midnight with 3 babies and no plan except forward, and had found, on the other side of the dark, not just safety, but something she hadn't let herself name for months. She named it now, quietly, in the sunlit room. She named it enough. She named it more than enough. She named it, finally, everything. And somewhere in the Thornwood, the border between 2 kingdoms, once a line drawn in old blood and older pride, quietly became a road. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Hit subscribe. The next chapter drops soon.